Today's session is on supporting marginalised student communities, and we're going to be talking about how universities support students that are statistically more at risk of being impacted by harassment and inappropriate behaviour. And today I want to make sure that we look at what the year-round plan is from that, from our guest institutions, and then also what happens if there is a spike and social issues that are covered in the press, such as the murder of George Floyd or the increase in spiking in clubs and bars, or the anti-trans headlines cause a spike in the reporting to the university, and what happens in that kind of let's call it crisis response for those people reporting. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Samantha Stewart, who is Advice and Response Manager for Safeguarding, Gender-Based Violence and Hate at the University of Manchester, and Richard Booth, who is Assistant Director of Student Governance, Mental Health and Wellbeing at Birmingham City University. Hi, Sam and Richard, are you okay?
Morning. Yeah, good. Thank you. As you know, Gemma, my internet's a bit dodgy, so I will attempt to have my camera on. And if it plays up, I'll have to turn it off. So apologies.
Yeah.
Apologies in advance.
Sorry, I'll flag if it is going a bit sketchy. So I'll come to my first question. Harassment, bullying and inappropriate behaviour can be experienced by everyone. However, we know that when students come from minoritized backgrounds or belong to any minority group, they're more likely to experience this kind of behaviour. So can you talk to us a little bit about your experience of students from minority groups reporting cases of harassment? And I'll start with Sam.
Yep, no problem. So morning, everybody. Yeah, so in terms of minority groups at the University of Manchester, we have some quite strong communities within the university that belong to minority backgrounds. And so what I am really keen to do is to identify those groups and see what reporting is coming in from there, and any targeted work that we need to do. What I have been doing recently is comparing the prevalence of reporting that we get from certain groups compared to the demographics of students across the university. And what we're finding is that for the most part, reporting marries up with the percentages of students that are at the university. But we don't know if that's, we don't think that that's because they're not experiencing more of this behaviour. We think that it's likely to be underreporting. So to give an example here, with LGBTQ plus students, they make up 12.5% of the population at the University of Manchester. Now, we actually have 16.1% of disclosures give their sexual orientation as fitting within the LGBTQ plus community. However, we've then got another 28% of reports that are prefer not to say. So it may be that a good portion of that percentage there also belongs to the community, but we don't know at the moment. But it's still significant enough. So, you know, 16.1% of reports are coming from this community. It's significant enough that we need to look at this further. In terms of bullying, harassment and discrimination towards Asian students within our university, they make up 19.8% of the population at the University of Manchester, so it's a significant part of our population. And we find that of the disclosures that we get on the topics of bullying, harassment, discrimination, that they're making up 21.9% of the disclosures. So it's similar-ish percentage-wise in terms of what we're getting through the system. However, again, we've got nearly 20% that say they prefer not to say when it comes to ethnicity. So again, it's that unknown there that we need to work with as well. So we know that these percentages are marrying up with what we're seeing as a population, but then it's the prefer not to say as well, which could add on to that from our side, and that's our concern really. I think one of the big areas, and it's one of our main focuses for this year, is in terms of women and other minoritized genders. So we have 55% of our population identify as female. However, in terms of reporting through the system of types of sexual misconduct, they make up 69% of all reports of sexual harassment, sexual assault, or sexual violence. So that's over the lifespan of our service having report and support in place. And that's a significant number to be thinking about that are experiencing this either at university or maybe reporting historical events that have happened to them. So this data in particular is something that we're focusing on at the moment because we're identifying this as an issue that we need to target at the moment. So in terms of our experience, it is quite broad, and what we're finding is that on a balance, the students that are choosing not to share demographic data with us are around about the same percentages of those in the minoritized communities that are sharing with us. And we want to work out how we can encourage more students to share with us on that, I think, so that we get this clearer picture of where there may be these higher peaks across our data.
I think that's really interesting, and I've got a couple of questions specifically about some of those percentages that you've mentioned. Well, the first one is a point really that 69% of female students reporting sexual harassment or sexual violence, even though that sounds high, and I agree that 69% is like a shocking figure, but it is almost in line with the NUS Hidden Marks research that was done back in 2010, which was around 60% of female students would experience sexual harassment or violence during their time at university. So so even though, in one way that's surprising, in another way it's absolutely sort of predictable, because that's kind of what, and the positive thing is that even though the research that came later, that is just the name of which has escaped me, Revolt Sexual Assault, said 2% of people who'd experience it would be happy to report it to their institution, only 2% of that 60%. And so the fact that you're seeing more than that is a positive thing. I would say we can always, we want to drive those reports up so that you can help support those students, but that should be seen as a positive, I would argue. The other thing was, it's really good that you know the percentage of how the population at the University of Manchester is made up in that way, because I know after GDPR came in, people kind of started deleting all of that kind of data because they thought they weren't allowed to keep it, and so now it kind of retrospectively trying to collect that data and understand the makeup of the organisation. So how do you how do you measure that? How have you captured that data?
So annually, the university releases an EDI report that breaks down staff and students into the different demographic data. So that's publicly accessible to be able to gather that information. Okay. So that's what I've compared with, which I can probably find the link and share it.
Yeah, that would be interesting, but I don't think that's necessarily standard practice. I don't think. Please correct me in the chat if I'm wrong, everyone. But yeah, I know GDPR spooks people in many ways, and collecting the demographic makeup of the institution was one of those ways. Richard, if I can come to you with the same question. So can you talk to us a little bit about the experience at BCU of students from minority groups and what you're seeing them reporting?
Yeah, so I mean, I suppose we're slightly different from Sam at Manchester in the sense that we fully launched in March to our staff and student community. So in some respects, we're still kind of building our data picture, because one thing we found is that we don't receive a great deal of reports where an individual is reporting on behalf of themselves and discloses their full demographic data. So it's quite a relatively small proportion of reports that come through are ones where we can rely upon the demographic data and use that to try and paint a picture. So I do think that, excuse me, in perhaps another 6 months' time, we'll be closer to where Sam is and be able to conduct a similar piece of work. And we also have our kind of broader demographics. I don't know about other institutions, but certainly we take part in something called the HESA return every year, where we have to provide our demographic data. So we have that every year, and we use that to kind of understand proportions reporting. Or we will be using it in that way. We already use it in terms of number of students subject to disciplinary or submitting complaints and things of that kind. We already do a big demographic analysis each year on that. So we're kind of building our picture to understand how some of our kind of minority communities are being affected by the reported behaviour. But while we're doing that, I think we're still at an early stage, so we're trying to make sure that report and support and its existence and its availability is embedded across the university, but particularly for those communities, so that they know it's available to them and is a source of support or sharing information if it's needed. So I think there's two things to that. The first is, and I think I checked with you in advance that a lot of people on the call are already users of the system rather than perhaps people thinking about it. But we did a lot of work with some of our SU societies who were representative of minority groups in advance of launching, to understand how it kind of looked to them, what language we were using, whether this was something that would work for their particular communities. And then since then, so the way we use our data at BCU is we have an EDI committee, a standing EDI committee, which is chaired by our university secretary and attended by one of the members of our board of governors. So it's intended to be a very high level committee, but equally it's quite broad in the number in who attends and what kind of roles and position they have at the university. So we produce a quarterly statistical report to say, this is what's happened through report and support within the last quarter. This is the picture since we launched. These are the kind of themes and trends that we think we're beginning to pick up. Now that will begin to incorporate a more kind of reliable demographic analysis going forward as the number of reports we're able to use as for our parameters builds up. But at the moment, it does at least act as a vehicle for us to reach out to members of the EDI committee who are representative of minority groups to kind of remind them that the tool is there, show that it's working. We report in that paper on actions we've taken since the last meeting, ongoing actions. So one of the things you mentioned in your initial kind of introductory comments, Gemma, was being reactive and seeing what's going on the outside world. So where we've done things like that. So we did, recently in light of the scandal at Yorkshire Cricket Club, and particularly around the story that came out where a racial slur had been used and it was dismissed as just having been banter. And we happen to have a campaign already called It's Not Always Banter. So it was a couple of years old, but we revived that and linked it to report and support and went out through our comms channels to say to students and staff, language of this kind isn't acceptable. If you're experiencing it, this is how you can report it to us. So actions of that kind we're able to capture and report into the committee, and use it also as a forum for feeding back. If those people who are representative of their particular community or group on the committee are having particular experiences, then they're able to share that with us. So we're still in that phase of trying to make sure that those communities feel able to use the tool and share with us their experience. And then, like I say, I would have thought, well, certainly the plan is come March next year, we'll have been using it for a year at that point. So we'll conduct a full kind of demographic piece at that point.
I think that's really positive, though, that you kind of saw what was happening in the news and then had a campaign to be able to roll out in response to that. And I know we can't necessarily always do that, but I think that's a really positive thing that because the language was pertinent as well for that particular situation, wasn't it? So that's really positive, and I think it's also really positive, and I would encourage all institutions to report that regularly to a senior team, because then it's on the agenda and it's getting discussed and attention from that senior level. Otherwise, if you don't have that senior buy-in, it can be really difficult to make change, and also arguments for like additional budget, should you need it. If you've always got that kind of running conversation throughout the year, then you don't kind of have to go cap in hand, as it were, once a year to justify why you need spend in this area. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I also think it's really beneficial to students who, it just demonstrates that we do take it seriously, and we didn't just create it so that we could say we had it in response to kind of external questions about whether we've got a system in place. We generally want to learn from it and use it as a tool to make our university a better and safer place. I should also have said the one area where we do, even though numbers are relatively low, the one area where there is clear differentiation is in the declared gender of reporting students, and it is predominantly female. And I've just done the numbers on my phone calculator while Sam was talking, and it was 68%, so almost precisely the same as Manchester, and in the stats in the report you referred to, Gemma.
Yeah, that's it's interesting that even though we've all been focused on this work, well, if Hidden Marks highlighted that back in 2010 and that statistic hasn't really changed, there's still a way to go, but at least we're all promoting our reporting systems and really promoting that speak up culture, so that people can access support when they need it.
Yeah, it would be interesting to conduct a piece of work to look at the report, whether, it's only reliable to a certain extent, but the apparent gender of the reported party as well, which we don't, it might be captured within the report, but we don't
ask for it. Yeah.
But just coming back to the point you also commented around spiking, we've had a lot of because there's been incidents at UOB also in the city. We've had a lot of meetings with our local community groups and police to talk about what we do around spiking and campaigns. And there's a temptation to go down the comms route and name it at victims rather than perpetrators. And we had a really good individual from Bristol County Council come and talk, who runs a campaign called Bristol Nights, who have done a big campaign around spiking in Bristol. And that's all predominantly perpetrator focused. So just thinking about how you support particular communities and how you respond to reports coming in, where you're only consistently recording and reporting the data on the reporting party. I do think it slightly strays your focus towards the reporting party and away from the reported potentially.
Yeah, it does, and a few of our partners do specifically ask about the alleged perpetrator, but it's not consistent across all 80 systems, and I think because there's a fear particularly in anonymous reporting, that you will find out the identity of the perpetrator, but not find out the identity of the victim survivor, institutions are nervous about asking more information about the perpetrator, but maybe we should be less nervous about that, because of the insight that it will give us is more important than the fear of finding out the alleged perpetrator. If that makes sense. So obviously at Culture Shift, we advocate taking a trauma-informed approach to supporting all students and staff. So Sam, how do you ensure that this support is effective and also considerate of the varying needs of specific student groups?
So one of the things that we introduced at Manchester, once we started to see sort of the increase in reports that were coming through from students, was we created a dedicated team that could support students who reported to us. And it's fully student-led, so I manage this team. It's the advice and response team. And what we do, we've currently got 3 caseworkers within the team. It will be increasing to 6 in the imminent future, which is very pleasant indeed. But yeah, so what my team do is when we get a report in, regardless of the type of incident that's being reported or who it is that's reporting to us, we invite them to an appointment initially to discuss with them what their needs are. So rather than us going in all guns blazing and saying, right, okay, we're going to help you with this, we're going to help you with this, we sit down with the student and we talk them through what's happened, whatever they want to share or don't want to share, and then we find out what they need at that point in time. So we're giving them that open room to be able to just share what they need to and then tell us what they need there and then. And if the students aren't quite sure, then we just dig a little bit further to go, okay, what's worrying you at the moment, what's really troubling you right now, and from that we can unpick what they need in the immediate future, and then in the medium, and then the long term. And that's when we'll loop them in with the relevant services or the relevant processes that need to happen inside the university. So in terms of supporting the students, we very much want it to be student-led. We want it to be based on what they need. In terms of making sure that we're making that support specific to each student that's coming to us, one of the sections we have on our report and support form is the option to request a specific type of advisor. And we find that quite often that is utilised for various purposes. So we get requests through for female-only advisors, we get requests through for an LGBTQ advisor, we get requests for a person of colour. We've had very varying requests come through there, and wherever we can facilitate it, we will. And where we can't, we'll work with the student to find out who they might be most comfortable with from the team. Up until quite recently, we had 3 female and 1 male caseworker on the team, and people of various backgrounds as well within the team. We have lost our male caseworker at the moment. However, my manager, the head of advice and response, is male. So where we get a request through for a male advisor, then he'll usually take those on so the student feels most comfortable. And then in terms of making sure that we're embedding the trauma-informed approach and that we're giving the most appropriate advice based on situation, we make sure that we've got an ongoing training package running for all of the caseworkers as well, so that they're up to date on any safeguarding needs, they're up to date on any particular issues that might affect our community, and bring in external organisations to talk on those as well.
I think that's really important, and the sort of demographic makeup of your caseworkers is really important. It's something that we're in our non-education partners really highlighting the importance of having if you're going to be trauma-informed and victim survivor led, having that choice of someone who's potentially had that similar lived experience to you to speak to, because I just think it removes a barrier to accessing the system in the first place. There's a very small group of like not it's a small group of caseworkers, and it is not representative of the makeup of the organization, and therefore they're seeing that people aren't accessing the service, basically. And I think that really speaks to that, and it's so important to have as many sort of groups represented as possible, like, including, non-binary and, like you said, male caseworkers, because there's a real, like nationally and, globally, there is underreporting of sexual violence against non-binary and male victim survivors, and we need to make sure that we're creating safe havens for people to access support and encourage that, and trying to remove those barriers. So it's really important, and I think that's really good that you're doubling the size of your caseworkers, and there's been a focus on that being a representative group. Richard, if you the same question to you, how do you ensure the support is considerate and effective for the needs of different minority groups?
Yeah, I mean, I think I touched on the fact that our well, this might have been in our pre-meet actually, Gemma, so I'll explain again. Our student reports that go through to our mental health and wellbeing team. So we have, as well as those team members delivering their appointments every day, we also have a duty and a safeguarding rota. So safeguarding, the person on the safeguarding rota will pick up high risk reports, and the person on duty will pick up slightly lower risk. This person just needs a follow-up call type things. And we have a casework coordinator within that team who has access to the system. So what will typically happen is a report from a student will come in, the casework coordinator will pick it up and assign it to whoever's on duty or safeguarding, or if there's a specific request for a particular type of team member, then it will be assigned accordingly. What we don't do, and I would really like to start, we don't kind of provide a specific question to say, do you want, say, male or female, or is there a particular type of individual you want to be contacted by? So I'll have a follow-up conversation with Rebecca about trying to implement that, perhaps, because I'd be really keen that we made that available. I always remember receiving an email from a student a couple of years ago who had, she said she was being bullied, but she was being bullied in association with her hair. She was a black female, and she was able to see one of our mental health advisors who was also a black female. And she said, I just don't think that anyone else would have understood what I was going through, because I was being bullied about my hair type as a black woman. And I just don't think someone who wasn't a black woman would have seen where I was coming from and would have been able to support me in the same way. So I've always remembered that, because it just felt so powerful at the time that we were able to provide such kind of tailored help. And we're really lucky. We were restructured a couple of years ago, and mental health as a team attracted a lot of resources. It's a big team. It's very diverse in all sorts of ways. And we have a trained pink therapist amongst the team as well. So we have quite a lot of kind of different skill sets that we're able to offer to students. But we do need to take that additional step and try and be more active in seeking students' input into who might follow up with them.
Yeah, and I think it's important to ask that question in the reporting process, and we'll look to include that in our best practice as well, but also amplify the fact that those caseworkers are there to receive disclosures, to sort of encourage that reporting as well, because it's probably not enough to find that out about that during the reporting process. It removes a barrier to reporting in the first place, doesn't it? So I think a combination of the question being asked and the fact that they're available to help is really, really important. And Sam did specifically mention this, but I'll ask you first, Richard. How much or how little do you involve external or specialist support when dealing with cases like this?
So we'll be led by the student in that kind of context. So similar to Sam, when reports come in, it will initially just be a supportive conversation to understand the student's experience and what they kind of want to happen, what their options are. So we'll include signposting to external organisations where appropriate. It might also be talking the student through our complaints procedure or our student disciplinary if there's an allegation against another student. So involvement of external will be kind of dependent on what the student says. We're also, I mean, I suspect Sam's the same given her institution, but we have a kind of police liaison officer, a local PC who works to several of the institutions across Birmingham, and is always kind of willing to have an initial conversation with a student around what a police report might look like. So if a student is thinking of perhaps making a police report as an example of an sort of external organisation, they can have that initial conversation without any expectation that they'll follow through with a report or without any formal record being taken, just an opportunity to speak to an officer who understands what is such a kind of complex system and process, and give them an idea of what they might expect should they go down that route. So we can facilitate that as well.
I think that's really positive. And you mentioned before when you were talking about the fact that within your team you have a trained pink therapist, which I haven't actually come across before. So could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so she's a kind of expert in LGBTQ plus issues and how therapy might be tailored to kind of be delivered to members of that particular community. She was trained many years ago at this point, but keeps it up through CPD. So she's able to kind of take on clients if they want specialist kind of advice in relation to their sexual orientation.
I think that's that's great, and it's, yeah, like I say, it's not something that I've come across before. We come across the SBLO role or similar a lot, but not necessarily specifically help, advice and support for a specialist person trained in issues faced by LGBTQ plus people. So that's really, really interesting. Sam, you mentioned about the fact that you bring in external or specialist support. How do you sort of go about kind of selecting and building those partnerships, if you like? I feel like we're very well what's the word, resourced in Manchester particularly, and like we've got someone speaking to Kenya shortly who's from the LGBT Foundation that's based in Manchester. So how do you go about selecting and partnering that specialist support?
Yeah, so I think we are really lucky being in Manchester and being so close to a lot of services here. And I'm sure Richard probably has the same look in Birmingham, being sort of central university based, central city based, I should say. Yeah, I mean, in terms of selecting the services, what we tend to do is we do as much research into all the options that are available locally, and then we kind of do a bit of expectation management with the students for each of them. So for instance, we've got 3 services locally that offer specialist counselling for sexual violence victim survivors. So we've got three options, or 3 key options in Manchester that we can refer students onto. Now, each one offers very slightly different services, and they've also got very slightly different waiting times as well. So what we'll tend to do is we'll offer all 3 options to the students, but explain kind of the pros and cons of each, and explain what each one does, explain what the waiting times are. And then we empower the student to make that decision on where they want to go. And then if they need help getting there, then we'll help with that. Where we haven't got as much choice and it's only maybe 1 or possibly 2 options to go to, then it is just being clear on what that service offers, and explaining that to them, seeing if that's suitable. If not, we can look for a national service, for instance. Similar to Richard, we have quite close links with GMP up here. And we've also been working with a couple of other local services, particularly around, so Richard mentioned about talking through the reporting process and so on. Recently, I've been working with a local group, and I'm still not entirely sure who she's linked with, but she ran the Northwest Sexual Violence Awareness Week. It's a lady called Becky, and she's put together some sexual violence support packs, which I'll link in the chat in a minute, because there's a great little resource document in there which they've condensed the court process down into 15 steps. So it's just a very clear, simple view of this will happen, and then if this happens, this will happen. It's broken down in a really easy to understand way. So I'll share that in a minute, because I think that is a really useful resource, and having all these local services is amazing. We are doing a review of all our external referral pathways at the minute, and we're also going to be doing more research with the students that are accessing them to make sure that they're happy with the services we're referring on to.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I would really like to see that kind of 15-step process, because I think, when you're involving like law enforcement into that situation, which is very traumatic and complex, it's really difficult. I think it's a difficult line to tread, of giving information and managing people's expectations of what a challenging process it is, without seeming to put them off that process. I think that is a really difficult a thing for you all to get right. And so yeah, I think that would be really really useful. Thank you for sharing that in the chat there. That's going to be really useful and interesting, I think, for colleagues on the call. You mentioned there, about doing some reviews about those referral pathways, which is good, because you're looking to sort of do that work like ahead of a report being received, rather than sort of in response to a particular report. How will you go about that, getting that student engagement, Sam?
I think we're going to start with our existing students that have access to the service. We have got our own internal trackers on who's been referred externally to different services in the community. So we're going to start by asking that question. But what I have found is, even recently, when we ran a keynote around sexual violence and harassment at the university, and at the end of that, I had a couple of students that came up to me and asked if they could give their feedback on those services. So we're quite lucky in the sense that we've got students that are willing to be proactive and come talk to us, but we also do want to go out and find the students that have been there, find out what their experiences were like, find out where we can work with those services to make it a little bit more student friendly if necessary, or the ones that are doing a brilliant job and that we can continue to send students to, confident that they're getting the best service.
Yeah, definitely. Richard, do you think you're going to be doing some reaching out to student groups to kind of find out, get that feedback, but also find out about other services that you could potentially refer to?
Yeah, definitely. I think that will form part of the review we conduct after a year of the system, to try and go back out, because like I said, we involved students when we first set it up, and then we've been kind of living it and experiencing having the system. And I think March next year will be a good opportunity to go back to students, including those who might have made reports, and try and understand whether it's working from their perspective, whether there's things that could be improved, whether there's things we're getting wrong. So yeah, absolutely, that would be something we look to do.
I'm going to invite questions from our listeners and audience, which I'm happy for you to put in the chat, or if you wanted to, put your hand up and and ask that question and unmute, I'm happy to do it that way as well, whatever you feel comfortable with. But before I do, we've obviously seen numerous events over the past year that have highlighted the importance of listening to your students from minority groups and ensuring that they're supported at all times. How do you act when these events happen? We've got a bit of a glimpse, from Richard talking about the sort of reaction of the university to the scandal at Yorkshire County Cricket Club. But how do you actively make sure that your students feel supported at times of political and social unrest? Richard, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, it's difficult. I think for us, it's predominantly done through kind of communications to students. But I think there's always a struggle as to where, at the institutional level, so not necessarily for kind of me, we have kind of well-being Twitter accounts and Instagram and things like that, where we're able to control the narrative largely as we see fit, as long as we're running it past our communications team. But at that institutional level, it's really difficult because I think there's perhaps more reluctance to begin pulling at the thread of the jumper. I mean, certainly BCU as an institution put out a statement around the death of George Floyd at that time. But I know just kind of anecdotally that then some staff would kind of say, well, but what about X event that's also in the press and also of great significance? Why is the VC not saying something about that? So in a sense, you sometimes encounter a kind of desire, well, perhaps not desire, but it might be easier perhaps to say nothing about anything, and then you don't put yourself in a position where you're having to kind of differentiate between events that take place globally and whether you say something about them or not. So it is really difficult. I think report and support in some senses can help that, because it can help you understand whether something's kind of impacting students at the same time, which again, going back to what you said earlier, Gemma, kind of helps you frame your narrative and helps you pitch a business case a bit more successfully if you're trying to say, we need to do something about this. I mean, this is not a kind of global event, but it links to what you mentioned in passing earlier around kind of transphobic incidents, where we had started to see stickers appearing in our female toilets that are anti-trans, and they're linked to, I confess I can't recall the name, they're linked to a national campaign. Of course, there's not a great deal we can do in response to that, because we can't identify, it's not possible for us to identify who's putting them up, because all we'd be able to check on CCTV was when people are going into the toilets, and if we don't know when the stickers appear, we don't know. So all we can do is take them down immediately and brief all the kind of cleaning staff and the like. But after it happened several times, we were able then to kind of go to the head of our communications team and say, look, and our head of EDI, and say, we need an institutional statement to say that this type of thing won't be tolerated, because at least that way, it will help us reach whoever might be doing this, should see that type of thing, understand the seriousness of their behaviour and the implications should they be identified as carrying it out. So report and support did help us, build a case and influence the communication channels. I think otherwise, like I said, it's a bit easier at a kind of local level. We control our local intranet, so we're able to kind of promote particular resources or particular external agencies, perhaps that are relevant at any given time, and reach out to students that way as well. It's also it's been useful for us in terms of our support, the support part of our site, which I think perhaps can get forgotten sometimes. People predominantly think of it as a reporting system, and I don't know about other institutions, but I think there's probably a temptation to get your support stuff sorted for launch and then forget about it a bit. Whereas actually we've come across events either externally or internally that have prompted us to think, oh, actually we must go back and review what we say in our support articles around X or Y, because we need to bring them up to date. So around the spiking, we've been back into our support articles around spiking and address that more specifically as an issue, in order to kind of make sure that that's captured in what's available to students.
Yeah, I think you flag a really interesting point there of obviously there's a lot in the news every day, isn't there? And it's difficult to know like what what the university should be making a statement on or not. Just across this year, we across the sort of reporting network have seen an increase in anti-Semitic abuse, which particularly came after the it was driven by the discussion in the news about Israel and Palestine, and we definitely saw that reflect in reporting. We also saw a increase in a word that I only learned last year and this year, which is xenophobia, which is anti-Chinese behaviour or harassment or abuse. There's definitely been an increase in that, kind of driven by sort of COVID and things like that. And then after, as I mentioned in the opening statement yesterday about Sarah Everard and everyone's invited, and then spiking recently, there's been an increase in women reporting misogyny and everything kind of all the way up to sexual violence. So maybe we as Culture Shift should be feeding back to the partner network to go, right, we've seen this increase across the board, and here is our kind of support article for you to build upon, so that we can have that kind of quick reaction together, because I think that would be potentially helpful to the network. Sam, what's like how does Manchester kind of react to things that are in the press, and then make sure that people know that the support is out there?
Yeah, I'd say it's not dissimilar from what Richard's described, to be honest with you. We have our broader communications team that look at the wider messaging that goes out from the university. What we've been trying to do more often recently is to ensure that there's a blurb in there that says, if you've been affected by anything that we've described here, here's report and support, essentially. Here's the support that you can access, which wasn't always included. It sometimes was and sometimes wasn't. So we're really trying to embed that in any message that it might involve any kind of unacceptable behaviour now. But then we've kind of got the other two levels to it, in the sense of that we have the proactive comms to students. We have a really good residential live team here who are willing to go out, talk to all the students that are in halls, find out if anyone's got any concerns off the back of any key events that are happening as well, which can sometimes prompt the reports that lead into part 3 of our response, which is making sure that we're prepped and ready within the team for any spike in reports. And what we tend to do is, when we have a peak period of disclosures coming in, is we triage everything that comes in. So if we have an incredibly busy period where we're seeing a lot of reports that come in, then we will triage them based on urgency. And so those ones that are showing the high risk, the high levels of distress, that's the word I was after. So high risk or high distress, they're the ones that we're going to try and get to first, to give them that rapid response, to make sure that they know someone's there, and then we'll work our way through them so that we've seen everybody, but those really emergent ones are seen first. So we have that as a matter of practice anyway, but it really comes into its own when we are in a peak period, really.
Yeah, okay, that's really interesting. I have a question from someone listening, which is, you mentioned earlier, Sam, that caseworkers are offered a continuous package of training. Can you give a bit more detail on what kind of training is offered?
Yeah, no worries. Now, not all of the caseworkers have worked their way through everything, but essentially, not long after I started, I sat down with my line manager and said, I want to send my team on training. What can I do? And he basically said, write me a list and we'll see what we can make happen. So I wrote a list. And it's a very long shopping list, I'm not going to lie. But what I did was I broke down what information each of my caseworkers needed for types of incidents, for different demographics, for what they might need for internal processes, and then general broader overarching training as well. So the training that's included, to kind of give you a bit of a snapshot, so incident wise, we've got the SVLO training listed as one of the main courses that they should go on. Domestic abuse training, we use the local safeguarding training that's available in Manchester, so it's all online at the moment because of current events, but they have an online safeguarding package that we ask them to access. So there are a few of the incident-based training. Then we go on to the demographic-based training, which is where we access things like the Centre for Hate Studies training that exists online. We work with our mental health and counselling teams here and disability services. We're hoping to get the LGBT Foundation actually to come and speak to our staff as well, and basically try and embed this information that for our communities. Then we'll look at our internal processes as well. So we'll look at making sure that they're educated on the security processes, res life, referrals into the different services, what the internal things like mitigating circumstances are, if anything's changed on that. Those kind of things are done on a rolling basis to make sure that the team are up to date on exactly what's happening in-house, because Manchester is a huge organisation, and if one thing changes, you don't always hear about it. So we've got this list. I think there's probably, I'm going to say, at least 30 odd training courses that I've put on the shopping list for my team, and they haven't done all of them yet, but it is kind of a checklist to work towards. And I think that's the key. It's just breaking down for your community what your students and staff, but primarily students, what your students are going to need from a caseworker that's in front of them. And I think, obviously, we spoke earlier about having a diverse team that people that are reporting can come to, and that is the ideal. That's the ideal, that you can have someone that can sit and can understand exactly what they're going through, but at the very least, the person that's speaking to someone should be able to empathize with what's happening and to appreciate what might be the impact on that individual in front of them. So that's really what we're trying to embed through the training as well.
Okay, that's really, really interesting. Thank you so much, Richard and Sam, for sharing your experience today. I think it's been really, really useful, both because because of everything that you've implemented and your experience, but I think it's been interesting to get a sort of difference of an organisation, an institution that's had the system for a number of years, and an organisation that has recently implemented. So thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope everyone listening has found that really, really useful.